amazing partners here will help navigate through this for us. But really just want to just welcome everybody for being here, for taking time out of this summer Thursday, I think it is, a summer Thursday, to really listen in for some good presentation and some good work that has been done by KABOOM. And so I just want to thank you all, and I want to thank the KABOOM team for this work has been going on for several years. And so really glad to bring it to this pivotal point to be able to share it with community. So I really want to just highlight and just start, the day, like, getting everyone to just think about when you were young, think about your favorite playground experience. You probably had a lot of good experiences on that playground. You probably fell off the slide. You probably got maybe a splinter. You probably, swang so high in the sky on your swing that you were just a part of the sky. So just want you all to get in that space on this Thursday afternoon or morning, which depending on which time zone you're in. But really wanted to just start today with, just why CHF and KABOOM have partnered. We have had a longstanding partnership, I think now it's 10 years, since 2013, to really talk about what it's like to create community-led play spaces, and really having not just having playgrounds built from a lot of adults, but really in partnership with communities, in partnership with youth. And so together over that past 10 years, we have really supported 2,900 Coloradans that in terms of benefiting almost 35,000 children annually with 28 playgrounds, 2 adventure cores, and other types of playgrounds. And if you have not been able to participate in a KABOOM experience, then we got to get you to move some mulch and build some playgrounds, because it really is a great experience. I think one of my most favorite parts of working with the Health Foundation has been a part of 2 builds, really being with community, being, using a drill, having the folks tell you really what to do and how to do the things, right? And so it's really been a joy. And I think I would just want to just lead into really the background of why we've done this Playspace Inequity mapping project. As we all know, our health is deeply connected to the places where we live, to the playgrounds, or not the playgrounds, to the outdoor spaces. And, it's been studies done that outdoor recreation really does benefit not only your physical health, but your mental health, right? Mm-hmm. They actually are an opportunity to support social connections. So think back to maybe some of the friends that you've made at the park when you were younger, or on playgrounds when you were younger, and the importance of that connection. And I really think since the pandemic, this is also, there's been a resurgence of the importance of playgrounds and parks and recreation and outdoors for kids. And so we really wanted to think through that. And so part of this is that we really needed to understand who has access to parks and who doesn't. And what that means also is playgrounds, if you drive by the community where you grew up at, they can last for a long time. But if you think about the safety part of that, we want to think about what communities actually have access to accessible, safe, and I would say culturally relevant play spaces, right? And so we really wanted to think through of how do we partner with KABOOM to address that to find out what it looks like, to really use the data, not for purposes of keeping the information with CHF or with KABOOM, but to be able to share that information with communities, because you all are the ones living and working in your communities, and your kids are playing in your communities. And so we wanted to be able to make informed decisions about where the gaps are in terms of play spaces. And I think for us, we also use this at CHF as an opportunity to really get to know folks in the community, to really get to know kids in the community. Oftentimes, my favorite part of this is the design. When the kids are involved in the design, most want hot tubs, most want water parks, but it's just this different way of engaging and interacting with communities. And it has been a pleasure. It has been an honor to be a part of this and to walk into this process and be able to walk into this program. And so we have some great information for you today. And just keep in mind your favorite space when you grew up. Just get into your kid mind. It's okay to get into your childlike mind today. And so I want to introduce Isaac and Colleen. They will be our presenters for today, and they have this fancy microphone. They have this fancy setup, and you all will be definitely impressed, hopefully, by the data. So welcome and enjoy.
Thank you, Monique, and thanks for noticing our high-tech setup. I'm going to have Colleen start us off, but we're both going to be talking and presenting to you all today.
Thanks, Isaac. I'm Colleen Coyne, specialist here at KABOOM, working on our learning and evaluation team. I'm just going to start off with some brief background about KABOOM. As an organization, our mission is to end place-based inequity for good. And as we move through this presentation, we'll share a little bit more about what place-based inequity means to KABOOM. Over the course of the last 25 plus years as an organization, we've worked with communities from around the country and quite a few locally in Colorado to improve or transform place spaces. Throughout the process of doing that, we've increased access to play spaces for almost 12 million kids and activated more than 1.5 million volunteers across the country, all behind the mission of bringing more opportunities to play to kids. As an organization, we think play is fun and has value in that, but it's more than just fun. It really is a developmental necessity for kids across the country and even the world, because play is one of the earliest things we can do to support the social, emotional, and physical health of kids. And we believe that every kid in every community deserves and has the right to a high quality place to play where they can live and thrive as they learn those skills for engaging in the world. That said, what we also recognize as an organization is, despite the fact that play is critical for kids, millions of kids across the United States are missing out on this opportunity. That has a lot to do with disinvestment, both historic and continuing, and systemic racism that has denied kids, especially children of color, access to high quality play spaces where they can feel a sense of belonging. And that's what place-based inequity is. It's a lack of a high quality play space where there is an absence of that sense of belonging in the community. So what do we know about place-based inequity? As it has been hinted at already, this is part of a larger partnership and longer project with the Colorado Health Foundation. We actually kicked off this specific mapping work way back in 2021, which feels like forever ago at this point, with a review of the different literature out there that already exists about place-based inequity for children. And we did that in partnership with our wonderful partners at NC State and the College of Charleston, supported by the Colorado Health Foundation. And during that process, we identified 4 key trends that I want to share a little bit about. So across the United States, there are pretty clear patterns of who has access to quality resources and who doesn't. We saw that the same patterns of inequity that apply to things like the achievement gap or access to healthy food and even healthcare coverage also largely apply to place-based access. The things that we identified through this work and looking at the data that matter are distance, quality, neighborhood, and history. So I'll break those down a little bit for you. When it comes to distance, low income, Black, Indigenous people of color, and rural communities are more likely to have limited access to play spaces where they live and learn, meaning there's fewer parks and fewer playgrounds at schools or in neighborhood for those communities. We also know that quality matters. So for many of those same communities, even if they do have access to a play space, it tends to be lower quality. And that could mean it's in bad physical condition, but it could also mean that the playground's smaller or it isn't a sufficient size for the number of kids that need to play there. It could also mean that the playground has low play value, meaning kids are less likely to want to consistently or repeatedly play on that play space because there's not new experiences for them when they go back. We also know that neighborhood matters. So low income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are more likely to have limited access to play spaces because of neighborhood factors, which could include everything from access to public transportation to personal safety concerns. Some of those concerns stem from historic and ongoing exclusion that many people of color have faced across the United States when trying to access public resources like playgrounds. And that really ties into the last thing I want to talk about here, which is history. So our communities are still shaped by historical practices like redlining, the US government's policy on designating majority Black and people of color communities as investment risks for housing and mortgage purposes. Decisions like that and decisions made in the 1950s to place highways and freeways through the center of thriving communities, particularly Black communities, all continue to shape what resources community members have access today in their community. So to understand place-based inequity and its negative ramifications for communities, we have to consider all of these factors together. So that leads us to our work in Colorado. Across the state, we looked at 3 specific areas. So the first is East Colfax Corridor, which is more of an urban hub that is between the city of Denver and Aurora. It's a really interesting space because it bridges 2 cities, 3 counties, and countless zip codes. We also looked at 2 counties that are more rural. So we looked at Otero County and Rio Grande County. Here's a quick map of our spaces zoomed out at the state of Colorado. You can see geographically, they're pretty diverse, but also in terms of size, there's a lot of diversity there. So in our dark purple, you've got Rio Grande County. In our lavender or light purple, we have Otero County. And way up there near Denver in hot pink, or as we call it at KABOOM, dragon fruit, we have the East Colfax Corridor. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Isaac.
Thank you, Colleen, and hello, everyone. I am Isaac Castillo. I am the Senior Advisor for Learning and Evaluation here at KABOOM. And let's talk a little bit about really why we're here today. We've had some good background on KABOOM and the work that we do, and we've heard some of the big picture history of what is going on with place-based inequity throughout the United States and in Colorado. But with this project, we're looking to identify areas in those 3 communities that we can prioritize for ongoing and current place-based inequity interventions or investments, meaning where is place-based inequity happening in these 3 communities? How can we think about prioritizing them and identifying them for current and continued investment? So here's how we looked at this as a challenge and as a problem. We looked at 3 different ways to kind of assess and prioritize communities within those 3 focus areas. We looked at this concept called place-based access and came up with a quantitative score for that. We looked at the concept of place-based inequity, so who has areas to play compared to others, and quantified that as well. And then we talked to residents. We talked to close to 400 residents in a number of different ways to collect qualitative feedback from people who live in these communities to help inform and provide a more complete picture to what the numbers of the quantitative data say. So we're going to go a little bit into how each of these things were calculated and how we got that information. But before that, I'm going to share what the priority areas are, because I know everyone is really interested in the findings. So we're going to start with that. We'll start with East Colfax Corridor, and we identified 5 communities or neighborhoods and 6 specific areas, which are highlighted in orange in this map, that we feel rise to the top in terms of prioritization for immediate and ongoing place-based inequity investments, or the building and construction and modernization of new areas to play for kids. The communities are North Aurora, Del Mar Parkway, Sable Altura Chambers Heights, and Southeast Hoffman Heights. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we got to these communities and how we prioritize them in a bit. But these are the 5 kind of communities and the 6 geographic areas in East Colfax that we feel rise to the top for prioritized place-based investments in East Colfax Corridor. If we look at Otero County, we split it up into sort of two different chunks. We had a primary focus area, which is North Rocky Ford, that immediately rose to the top when we were talking about Otero County areas for prioritization. But then we had areas further south in Holly, Roberta, South Rocky Ford, and in Tempest and Ayer that also showed up as needs, especially needy compared to the other focus areas that we were looking at, but weren't quite as high need as the North Rocky Ford area. So there's a lot of orange that you're seeing on this screen, but know that the lower area represents a more rural area where there aren't a lot of people, particularly in the southern part of Otero County. So if we're talking about neighborhoods or communities, these are the three or the groupings of the two groupings that we are talking about for prioritized investment in Otero County when it comes to play spaces. And then when we looked at Rio Grande County, the one area that jumped out for prioritization was the town of Del Norte. There is a little bit of need in some other communities, particularly in Monte Vista, but the town of Del Norte is the one that we identified as the one as highest need at this current time based on the analysis that we completed. Now, you may be wondering, well, how did you get to these conclusions and how did you identify these communities for prioritization? And I'm going to share a little bit about how we came to these decisions and the information we collected. So there's going to be a little bit of a conversation here on the methodology and what we did. I also would love to remind people that if you have specific questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and Colleen and I will do our best to answer them in real time. And there will also be some time at the end of this presentation to talk about and answer some questions or to go deep on any of these concepts. So before we talk about the methodology, I want to start with one really important kind of framing of how we looked at the data. And it's important in terms of understanding geography. And so I want to start with a quick primer on the census tracts. So some of you may be familiar with what a census tract is, but for those of you who are not, a census tract is a geography, a drawn border of a community or an area of land done by the U.S. Census Bureau that is attempting to capture an area of approximately 4,000 people. Because of the way natural borders fall, like streets and rivers and mountains, they're not always exactly 4,000 people. They can vary between about 1,000 or 1,200 people and 8,000 people, but we're shooting for an area of about 4,000 people. A census tract is a good approximation of a small neighborhood or community and reflects the smallest amount of land or the smallest geographic area where the Census Department collects data at a nationwide level on a consistent basis. Now, a census tract can be really big or really small, depending if they're in rural or urban areas. An urban census tract with about 4,000, 5,000 people could be just a few city blocks, whereas a more rural community may have a census tract that is 10 or even more square miles in size, depending on just the distribution of people. And we say this because all of the analysis that we're going to talk about going forward is rooted in the concept of census tracts. And our recommendations are done at the census tract level because they represent a good sized community where we would expect and hope to see a lot of play spaces to be occurring throughout the communities that we're focusing in Colorado. And to give you an idea of what these look like, here are the census tracts that we looked at and examined for East Colfax Corridor. And here are the census tracts for Otero County. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the southernmost census tract in Otero County is really quite large, dozens and dozens of square miles. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Colleen, and she's going to tell us about the first step in our methodology and what we did to start our analysis.
Awesome. So when we started the process of mapping place spaces, the first thing we did was look at what information already exists about place spaces across these three areas. So we looked at public schools, housing communities, and parks in particular. And then we tried to source that data from existing places like nonprofits, government agencies, and even universities. While there was some data out there, one of the big gaps that we identified at the start of this project was a need to do some more in-depth work to identify place-based locations. So in partnership with OpenStreetMap Foundation US, as well as our partners at NC State and College of Charleston, we participated in a volunteer-based mapping effort, which focused mostly on our 2 rural counties, Otero County and Rio Grande, but also included some supplemental work in East Colfax Corridor. From there, the study team combined all of those data across our different sources to identify and create a list of current public place-based locations across all 3 regions. Here are a couple of limitations to our approach. It's important to note that while we did map a lot of playgrounds, we weren't able to do a full inventory of play spaces in the area because we really were focusing specifically on public playgrounds. Because we wanted to make sure that our work was really talking about what is free and accessible for all community members. Because of that, we didn't have the time and resources to identify and do verification work for all of the private play spaces. And we do want to note that there was some discrepancies between what on paper was open to the public and what we found to be true when it came to actually accessing the play space. So you can see on the side of the screen, we actually have an image of a no trespassing sign, which was at a public school playground, which had previously been identified as open to the public. But when we got there to the site, we realized it was actually limited to the students, which makes sense. We're happy students have a place to play, but it meant that it wasn't a place that any community member looking for a playground could access. Here is another example of an inaccessible play space. You can see again, this is a gated playground that's got some limitations in terms of who can access it. So we know that this playground exists and that more than likely kids who live in this community are using it, but due to its being closed off, we weren't able to actually include this in some of the further assessment work that we did. So from here, we actually went about creating maps of the playground locations. Here you can see a map of East Colfax Corridor, and we did include a buffer zone, which is why you see some playgrounds that are falling outside of the actual outline of East Colfax Corridor that we created across the region. Across all 3 regions, rather, the playgrounds that we've included on these maps are the ones that we found to be open to the public. So here you'll also see Rio Grande and Otero County. I think not surprisingly, you see clusters of play spaces in both of these counties because they are rural and large parts of the actual county aren't densely populated due to the presence of like state parks and other amenities like that. So given all of this information we already had, we really wanted to focus on 2 concepts when it came to what the need for new play spaces was: existing access to play spaces and play space inequity. Within that, we also took the time to incorporate community voices and want to thank all of our local advisors across our 3 regions that provided us invaluable feedback on what it was like for them to play in their community.
All right, thank you, Colleen. So once we knew where the play spaces are and we mapped them, then the next step was then to figure out how accessible they were to various communities. And we took 3 kind of approaches to determining that. The first is a count of the actual number of play spaces within a census tract boundary. And again, this is where coming back to that concept of census tracts. And we called this the concept of play space presence. Just basically the count or the number of play spaces within a community or a census tract, with a little bit of a buffer zone across that census tract or around it, because most human beings don't limit their lives to the census tract that they live in. And they could be living in one community that's right on the edge of a census tract, but could walk literally across the street and access a playground. And we wanted to capture and reflect the realities of kind of what life is like living in neighborhoods when you're accessing play spaces as part of this analysis. Additionally, we looked at this concept of place-based density, which is slightly different than place-based presence. This is how much of a neighborhood or a community of a census tract is close to a play space. So we define close in a couple different ways, and I'll talk about this more in a bit. But in East Colfax Corridor, we talked about the concept of close being half a mile, which approximates about a 15-minute walk. And in Otero and Rio Grande counties, it was 3 miles. And this really was just a reflection of how much of a census tract or community has a play space that is close. A percentage of that community has a play space that's close. And then the final concept we looked at, which is also extremely important in this, is the quality of those play spaces. So using a tool, we developed a score that really helps us determine what the quality of play spaces are. Because in theory, it's great if these communities have play spaces that are close to them and there's a number of play spaces that they can get to. But if those play spaces are low quality, they have broken slides, broken swings, the flooring is poor, there's only one set of components that kids can use, the quality of those is going to be deterrent for their use, or they may not be used at all. So taking into account quality in our analysis was extremely important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these concepts in a little bit more detail, just to help people understand what we did and how we came to our conclusions. So for this concept of place-based presence, as I mentioned, we were looking at the number of play spaces that were open to the public, again, within a community, within a census tract, and then taking into account this buffer zone around it, we're within a half a mile of the boundaries of that census tract. So here's an example of what this would look like in East Colfax Corridor. The census tract is this square with the black outline in the middle. And if you were to count those dots, there are 5 playgrounds or play spaces that are accessible and open to the public within that census tract. So initially it's a count of 5. But then if you look at that buffer zone that represents a half mile around that census tract, or approximately a 15-mile walk, there's a lot more play spaces there. There is an additional 9 play spaces. So for this census tract, the count, or the play space presence count, is actually 14 and not 5, because we felt it was important to include those ones that are immediately outside the census tract that people, quite frankly, are probably using and walking to on a regular basis. Now, this does mean that in some instances, in many instances, some of these play spaces are double counted. That's okay, but because we feel that this is a good representation of people living in the community and how they are accessing these play spaces. But it is a limitation that we did want to call out. Now, so that's the concept of place-based presence. And so we have these counts for every one of the census tracts in all 3 of the focus communities. In addition to place-based presence, then we looked at this concept of place-based density, which is slightly different because we're talking about the percentage of the area of the census tract that is close to a play space. And again, close for East Colfax Corridor is the same amount as the buffer distance, or basically a half a mile or 15-minute walk. So we're looking at housing and residences that are the percentage of those areas that are approximately within half a mile of a play space in the Colfax Corridor. But in Otero and Rio Grande counties, which are much bigger and the populations are more spread out, we define close as 3 miles. And there was a reason we chose 3 miles. And we actually did a little bit of a deep dive with this when we were doing the study work, because we really were considering what the good or correct distance would be, because a lot of the existing literature on this work is very focused on urban areas and very much defaults to that half a mile distance of considering close to a play space. But we all know that some of these rural census tracts are big in terms of land area, big in terms of square miles. And we didn't feel that half a mile that's traditionally used in urban environments is appropriate. We also were recognizing that the traditional half a mile distance is really more attuned to a walking distance. It's meant to represent approximately a 15-minute walk, but in rural communities, driving is more common, and oftentimes you have to drive to get anywhere. And so we wanted to test or look at a distance that is more accurate or reflects more of the way just life is lived in some of these rural communities that need to drive to get to any sort of public use, public utilities. We actually looked at 3-mile distances and 10-mile distances as part of this study, and we consulted with a lot of local residents there in Colorado to see if this made a difference, and the opinions were split. Some people thought 3 miles was best. Some people thought 10 miles were best. We actually did our analyses using both and found that there really was no difference depending on how we define this. The percentage of the area of the census tract that was considered close was the same whether or not we used a 3 mile or 10 mile distance. So for this study, we use a 3 mile distance for the analysis. However, this is a great area for additional study and rich for kind of further analysis for anyone who's interested, particularly in the connection between rural play spaces and how far people commute to get to those play spaces. So that's play space presence, that is play space density. And the third thing we looked at is play space quality, because quite frankly, in the real world, not all play spaces are equal. You're going to find play spaces that look like this a lot more frequently than you would imagine. So I'm going to turn it over to Colleen again to talk about how we measured play space quality.
Thanks, Isaac. So KABOOM, in partnership with Playspace experts, created a quality assessment tool that we can use in the field to actually understand what the existing quality of playgrounds is. This tool looks at a variety of things, including rating play space components. So what is the condition of things like slides, swings, climbers, those steps and platforms kids are using to scale the playground every day. It also looks at play space amenities. So what are the things that are around the playground that make parents and caregivers, caring adults more likely to bring kids to the play space? So what's the condition of seats and benches? Are there drinking fountains, shaded areas? And lastly, we looked at the general condition and safety rating of playgrounds. So what are the ADA pathways like? What's the existing play space surface like? Are there trees and other vegetation surrounding the area? Most of these were rated on a 4-point scale, with 1 being unacceptable, meaning it was dangerous or broken, and 4 being good, meaning there was no problems with the playground, it was in great condition. Here are a few examples of what a low quality playground looks like. So this is actually a photo from some of the work that was done by our study team on the ground in Colorado. And as you can see, the safety surfacing is overgrown. There's plants growing into the play space. All of those things make it less than ideal in terms of condition when it comes to use by community members. But condition can look like a lot of different things. So here's another example.
And I think before we move in, Colleen, I think this is how our analysis and our instrument is a little different than I think what other people traditionally do. Because if you look at the structure itself, it looks like it's in really good condition, right? But the challenge here with the quality of this play space is, as you mentioned, the flooring, the surfacing is just not in great shape. And there are genuine safety concerns with some of the foliage and the plant life growing onto the play space itself, which creates a risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So these play spaces might represent what you more typically think of when it comes to quality concerns, but as Isaac just mentioned, their quality concerns look like a variety of things, and that's one of the sort of things we had in the back of our mind when creating this tool. But as you can see, this playground has rusted and chipped painting, the safety surfacing's been patched a bunch, there's some graffiti in the background. All of those things are part of the condition that make this playground probably a good candidate for at least some repairs, if not replacement. And then lastly, we've got some more examples of playground condition. So you can see in these photos, the slide is cracked and broken, creating a safety hazard when kids are going down. These ropes on the climber are starting to fray, making it potentially dangerous for kids. And again, you see another slide with some damage. Slides are very commonly damaged because they are one of the most fun things to do on a playground, in my opinion, meaning kids are going down them a lot. And so what we really wanted to keep in mind with all of this is that, and share with you all, is that this quality isn't simple. We really have to look at that condition and the play value of the playground together. So looking, sort of zooming out across our 3 regions in Colorado, we identified the quality of play spaces across all three regions. Wanted to share a little bit about that with you. So in East Colfax Corridor, we found that there were 229 playgrounds. When we did on the ground assessments, we found that 119 were open to the public, and those playgrounds had an average quality score of 2.14. And again, the quality score is on a 1 to 4 scale, with 1 being unacceptable and 4 being good. Important to keep in mind, again, as we're looking at this score, this is also including that play value. So there were some playgrounds that were probably in fine condition when it came to, are they up to all of those ASTM safety standards? But they were like relatively small or lacked a lot of opportunity for multiple kids to play. In Otero County and Rio Grande County, we found that relative to population, as you might expect, there were fewer playgrounds. So in Otero County, we had 36 playgrounds, 34 were open to the public, and they had an average quality score of 2.02. And in Rio Grande County, we found 39 playgrounds, 31 of which were open to the public, with an average quality score of 1.87. And in both Otero and Rio Grande County, many of the playgrounds we looked at were significantly older than some of the playgrounds that we found in East Colfax Corridor.
Thank you, Colleen. So as a reminder now, we looked at where play spaces are. We looked at how many were in a census tract. We looked at how much of that census tract is close to a play space. And then we looked at the quality of those play spaces. And all of that information put together came up with our determination of what we called overall play space access. But in addition to play space access, we wanted to look at some of the other factors that may be driving inequity in these communities. If we kind of remember back to Colleen sharing with us some of our larger findings in history with what happens with play spaces in the United States, there is a lot of systemic racism and systemic disinvestment that tends to happen in communities. And so we wanted to figure out a way to try to track that and quantify it in a way to include it in our analysis. So the way we went about measuring play space inequity is through a instrument that KABOOM created called the Playspace Inequity Prioritization Index, or you're going to hear us call it PIPI a lot because PIPI is a lot shorter than Playspace Inequity Prioritization Index. The PIPI is a combination of 21 publicly available data points into a score for every census tract in the United States. So we didn't just do this for Colorado or these 3 communities, we did it for every census tract in the United States. And it is meant to estimate place space inequity at the census tract level, but it's only an estimate because we're using publicly available data at the census tract level to sort of capture what we think is going on in these local communities. For those of you that wanted to go into the math, we can have a follow-up conversation about it, but it's important to know that it is a standard Z-score calculation, and the value or the number for the PIPI score represents how many standard deviations you are from kind of like the average or typical place-based inequity situations that's happening in the United States. I mentioned there are 21 things that went into the calculation of the PIPI. I'm going to walk through those really quickly for those that are curious, and they fall into 3 larger buckets. The first are pretty common population or demographic characteristics. The percentage of the population that is BIPOC, median income for the community, the population and the number of children, is there language use and language isolation, so non-English speakers, children under 18 with a disability, and residential properties with 2 or more units, which are meant to capture housing density or a lot of people in the same space. Then the second bucket of indicators was what we call inequity indicators, or sometimes thought of as proxies of racism or systemic racism. So we're looking at areas that have low levels or low amount of life expectancy at birth, a high percentage of children receiving public benefits, excessive housing costs in terms of ownership or renting, the number of HUD subsidized units, and the unemployment rate. And then the third bucket of indicators is what we call park access in the built environment, which represents the parkland, the number of parks in a census tract, the percentage of those census tracts covered by park space itself, the number of schools with a particular emphasis on elementary schools, and then a bunch of things that helped us look at transportation infrastructure, as well as children with low access to healthy food and households without computer or internet. And so a lot of these are proxies of just what the neighborhood looks like, in addition to what the population of those neighborhoods look like. And again, we took all 21 of these things, standardized them, smushed them together with a lot of math, and then came up with a single score for every census tract within the study areas. And as a reminder, we had a score could be 0, which means it has sort of the average or typical amount of place-based equity or inequity that is happening in that census tract. And any scores that had a negative PIPI score, a negative value, reflect less place-based inequity or less need. These would be more affluent communities, more communities that are more white, that have a lot of park space, that have a lot of public infrastructure, that represent less of a need or less of a priority for additional place-based investment. Conversely, communities with a positive PIPI score have more place-based inequity, representing more of an opportunity or more of a need for investment. These are lower income communities, communities that tended to be BIPOC or large percentages of BIPOC, and that don't have supportive public infrastructure that many communities that are having negative PIPI scores would tend to have, or more affluent communities would have. So we took these PIPI scores, combined it with all the place-based access data to help then create an initial round of prioritization for place-based investment within the 3 focus areas. But then we did some additional work to then talk to community residents, because it's one thing to collect all this great mapping data and all this quantitative data, but we wanted to ground truth it with what residents were seeing on the ground living in these communities day to day. So we did 2 things to collect this resident feedback. The first thing is we worked with many local advisory groups and local people there in the 3 communities, and hopefully a few of you are actually on the webinar today, to collect stories on neighborhood play spaces. So we had these local groups engage with residents in public spaces and ask them questions about where do they play, what's the quality of the play spaces they're at, are there any concerns, do they feel safe? And we took all of those stories and collected them and kind of included them in the analysis. In addition, we distributed an online survey to collect stories and impressions from people who couldn't participate in the local advisory groups to get additional information on the closest play spaces. We made yard signs and put up the links for these surveys in public areas. We used email distribution lists from a lot of our local community partners to get the word out to collect these surveys. And in total, between the surveys and the stories collected through the advisory groups, we got feedback and stories from 392 residents across all 3 of the study areas. Now, that's great. We were very happy with that. And it's very complimentary of what we were doing with the quantitative work. But there's a couple things I also want to bring up as part of this conversation. The first is that the resident stories we collected sometimes included feedback on private or not open to the public play spaces. So we heard earlier that a lot of the play spaces that exist in these communities are locked up, sometimes for very good reasons, so that people can't access them. But residents still wanted to talk a lot about those non-public play spaces, and that's okay. I think it really was helpful to give context to our analysis, but one of the overarching themes we heard through this analysis and through the resident feedback is that a lot of the really high quality, nice play spaces that everyone wants to use and that kids really love are not open to the public. So I'll say that again, the play spaces that are most loved and most used by residents are not open to the public. And so it's just an interesting finding from community residents sharing what they're thinking and how it is complementing the work that we did on the quantitative side of things. So I want to give a couple examples of what this looked like on the ground. So one example in Otero County is El Valle Apartments, which is this play space on the map here that's circled in white. And here are a couple of the pieces of resident feedback that we got specific to El Valle Apartments. So limited play areas, equipment is older, little gravel on the play surface, and there's no shade. A second comment was little equipment, most of it doesn't seem after all safe overall, and another comment about shade. So again, we took this information, combined it with the quantitative stuff to help us tell a full story of how we should prioritize. Here's an additional example from Otero County in Manzanola City Park. So it'd be this area, but if we zoom into it, it's this particular play space. and additional kind of qualitative feedback from residents. It's nice park with potential, but a little bit run down, and one of the slides is broken. Another resident commented that the playground has been upgraded, but the slide is still in need of repair, and the mulch, the surfacing is old and appears to be packed hard and hasn't been replaced. And the third comment was very in line with the first two: newer playground, mulch is packed hard, landscaping fabric is showing under the high use area of swings. So we took all of this information for all the focus areas for all of these play spaces, put that all together. And again, as a reminder, here's where we came up in terms of our recommended priority areas for the 3 focus communities, with East Colfax Corridor coming up as the highest priority. These census tracts that you see in orange representing the communities of North Aurora, Del Mar Parkway, Sabre Altura Chambers, Chambers Heights, and Southeast Hoffman Heights. In Otero County, the primary focus area that we were recommended should get play space modernization or focus or investment is the North Rocky Ford area, with secondary focus areas in Holly, Roberta, South Rocky Ford, and then Tempest and Ayer. And then in Rio Grande County, it is the town of Del Norte. And so these ultimately are the areas that we are recommending as a study team that should be prioritized for any thinking in terms of additional play space investment for these 3 communities. There's a lot more to this study. We only had a limited amount of time. So on the screen here, you will see hyperlinks to get additional information and the full study online, or you can scan the QR code and it'll take you to a page where you can access the full study documentation, because there's a lot of good, rich information, particularly of those of you who are residents of these communities. You'll be able to dig in, look at the maps in a real detail and see what we found for each of those play spaces and each of these communities that we're recommending getting prioritized investment going forward.
And for our local advisors, we'll also be sending you individual regional reports that focus specifically on your area. So keep an eye out for that. I will be sending those out shortly after we wrap up. But with that, we do have some time for questions. If you've got questions for KABOOM or the Colorado Health Foundation, we also have some other participants from our study team from NC State and College of Charleston here in the chat if you have questions.
I just want to say thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, KABOOM. Thank you, all of you, the support. The number one question that I think I did get, not here today, but why these 3 communities? Well, we started with these particular 3 communities through some other deep investment and community engagement work. And another part of this is sharing this with other funders, right? Other funders that are prioritizing outdoor space, recreation and things of that nature, to perhaps partner with KABOOM to do this deep level of research and engagement with other parts of the community, other parts of the state. And so the hope is that just nationwide and statewide, that other organizations will partner to gather this data, which I think, as you all heard, is very deep, intentional, and focused. And what I really want to highlight is, the lens that it takes, right, to talk about structural racism and things of that nature. So I really just want to commend all of you for that. So thank you.
And Kevin just put a link to the full study in the chat for those of you that would like to check it out at your leisure.
And it looks like we just got another question in the chat from Michelle. So it's 2 parts. One, are you able to share the GIS data with the local jurisdictions to give us a starting point to use for full city analysis? I believe the answer to that is yes, and that is our plan to share back data, especially in our 2 rural counties. One of our amazing study team members, Jane, did a ton of work reaching out to local organizations trying to gather some of that data. So we do have a plan to share that back. And then 2, how did you weight all of the priority factors against each other for analysis? Did any element have a higher weight than another? Do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, I mean, they were all fairly equally weighted, right? So if we think about the concept of place-based access, which included sort of the presence, the density, and the quality, those were all equally weighted to come up with the place-based access. And then place-based access as a whole was equally weighted to the inequity stuff, the PIPI score stuff that we had. And then we also kind of equally weighted, it's a little harder because it's not like a calculation, but we equally weighted the resident feedback, because we thought it was important to figure, like, if a resident is saying one thing on the ground that isn't similar to what the data is showing, we need to kind of represent that in the prioritization and the calculations. So it was kind of equally weighted, but that's just kind of where we felt the analysis was taking us as we were looking at the data. There was an additional question from Aaron, Colleen, about nature-based play factoring into the assessment of playground quality or improvement. So can you talk a little bit about sort of play value in the playground quality assessment that we used?
Yeah, awesome. So play value is an interesting concept to think about. Not everyone spends as much time pondering on it as I do, but play value really represents how many novel or exciting play opportunity kids are getting when they're using a play space. And that could be a traditional playground. You think with the posts and the decks. It could also be a nature play or nature exploration area where kids have the opportunity to engage with different levels of inclusive and sensory play that really helps them connect to nature. So when we're thinking about play value, what we really mean is we want kids to have a diversity of options when they're at a play space, that there's a lot of different things for them to play with. And we also want to ensure that kids of a variety of abilities have the opportunity to engage in play at these play spaces. So whether that is specifically looking at like wheelchair accessible play components, if it's looking at ground components with different panels that kids can engage in sensory play opportunities, or if it's looking at things like a nature play exploration area where kids would get the opportunity to look at local vegetation is surprisingly hard word to say, and get the opportunity to be exposed to some of the things that are native to their community. And so the reason why we include play value in quality, it is really because of that. You can have a really high condition set of swings, but if that's the only thing that exists at your playground, kids probably aren't going to be that excited about coming back and playing that often. You know, as a kid who loved swings growing up, swings and slides, my two favorites, there's only so much time you can spend on the swing, but when you've got a lot of different opportunities to play at a playground, you've got the opportunity to move around, to do a circuit, and all of those things really are the underpinnings of play value and why we think it's maybe not 100% as important as quality, because it has less to do with like physical safety, but why it ranks really high up there closely with the physical condition.
We do have like a few more minutes. I don't know, Monique, if you had any last comments or thoughts, or if there are any last questions.
So I don't have any questions. Well, I have a million questions, but I don't have enough time for a million questions. But if there are folks that are attending the webinar and want to get in touch with a program person that maybe works in your community, if you're not already connected to CHF, please reach out to us directly or reach out to me directly. I will actually put my email in the chat and I will get you connected. But we would love to hear, the utilization of this in your communities. KABOOM has been very, very, very open. They've been very collaborative in terms of explaining the data. Isaac actually came to our team and explained some of the data for us non-GIS mapping folks, and really appreciate, it's a lot of data, but it can be chunked out in the report. Really impressed with the report. So if you have any other follow-up questions for myself, you can email me, and I'm sure the KABOOM team will share someone's contact information for you all to connect with.
Thanks, Monique. And I just wanted to offer a final thank you to our partners at Colorado Health Foundation and at NC State College of Charleston and all of our local advisor groups across Rio Grande, Otero counties, and East Colfax Corridor. This work would not have been possible without you, and we're so excited to finally be getting this data into your hands so that you can go out there and start addressing place-based inequity within your own community.
Yes, thank you very much, Monique. I think this is an important piece of research and study that contributes not only there in these 3 local communities, but for the entire state, and can serve as a model for additional similar projects throughout the United States.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. All right, I think we're putting some emails in there. Yes, thank you all. Appreciate you all. And we're not holding you from lunch, so have a great lunch. Well, for those of us in Denver.
Right.
For Colorado, we're not holding you from lunch. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And do go and check out the report. There's a lot of interesting and cool features on the online version that we weren't even able to talk about today. There's a lot of really interesting maps that you can play around with and get much more detailed information in the full report.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Hey.